The war ends, but the race begins. When the smoke cleared over Europe in 1945, the world thought the war was over. But in secret rooms from Washington to Moscow, a new kind of race began. Not for territory, but for the future of space itself. The last bombs had fallen. The skies over Europe, once lit by fire and fear, were finally quiet. Soldiers returned home, cities lay in ruins, and the victors of World War II stood before a shattered world. Yet beneath the rubble of the Third Reich, something remarkable and unsettling was waiting to be discovered. It wasn't gold or art or stolen treasure. It was knowledge. Knowledge that could shape the future of humanity itself. In the final months of the war, American and Soviet forces raced toward Germany, not only to end Hitler's reign, but to seize his secrets. Both nations knew that Germany had achieved technological miracles: jet engines, guided missiles, and most of all, the terrifying V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range ballistic missile. These rockets had rained destruction upon London, traveling faster than sound, impossible to intercept. To the Allies, they were weapons of terror. But to scientists, they were glimpses of something greater, the first steps toward reaching the stars. The discovery beneath the ashes. As American troops pushed deeper into German territory, intelligence officers began uncovering hidden laboratories buried in the mountains and countryside. Inside, they found machinery, blueprints, and scientists who had worked in secret under Hitler's orders. Among them was Wernher von Braun, a young and brilliant engineer who had led the Nazi rocket program from the infamous Peenemünde base. Von Braun and his team were far from ordinary engineers. They were the minds who had taken humanity's first leap into the high atmosphere. Their V-2 rocket had soared 200 miles above Earth, touching the edge of space. But their genius came at a dark cost. Tens of thousands of slave laborers had died building those same rockets in underground tunnels at Mittelwerk. As American intelligence interrogated von Braun and his scientists, a realization dawned. If these men fell into Soviet hands, the balance of power in the post-war world could shift overnight. The Soviet Union under Stalin was already pushing to expand its influence. America could not afford to lose this race, not this one. Operation Paperclip, a deal with shadows. In late 1945, a secret U.S. intelligence program was born. Its code name, Operation Paperclip. The mission was simple: to recruit the very same Nazi scientists who had built Hitler's war machines and bring them to America. But there was a problem. These men had sworn allegiance to the Führer. Some were members of the Nazi Party, and many were complicit in war crimes. Publicly, the U.S. government could never be seen as giving refuge to Nazis. Privately, however, the calculus was different. The Soviet Union under Stalin was already capturing German scientists and transporting them to Moscow. The Cold War was brewing, and scientific superiority was now a matter of survival. So, documents were rewritten, files were cleaned, Nazi affiliations were erased. One by one, the scientists were flown to American soil under new identities. The official story was that they were technical specialists aiding U.S. defense research. In reality, they were the architects of a new age, the rocket age. From the ruins of war to the deserts of America. Von Braun and his team were first sent to Fort Bliss, Texas, and later to White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. The sun-scorched desert became their new laboratory, a far cry from the bombed-out factories of Peenemünde. There, surrounded by secrecy and sand, they began reconstructing the V-2 rockets from memory. American soldiers who had once fought the Nazis now guarded them, The irony wasn't lost on anyone. But for the military, results mattered more than morality. The Soviet Union was testing rockets of its own, and every second counted. Slowly, under von Braun's leadership, the team began advancing beyond the V-2. The rockets grew larger, faster, more powerful. The Americans wanted missiles that could cross continents, capable of delivering nuclear warheads, and these German engineers knew exactly how to build them.
The race heats up. By the early 1950s, the world had changed. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a battle for dominance, politically, militarily, and now scientifically. The Cold War wasn't fought with bullets. It was fought with equations, engineering, and ambition. In 1957, the Soviets shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. It was a metallic sphere no bigger than a beach ball, but its beeping signal from space echoed like thunder across the world. The U.S. was caught off guard, humiliated even. Suddenly, Congress, the Pentagon, and the American public demanded action. And when America needed a rocket expert to answer the challenge, they turned to none other than Wernher von Braun, the man who had once designed Hitler's rockets. From vengeance to vision. Now working for NASA, von Braun and his team began building the Saturn rockets that would one day carry astronauts beyond Earth's orbit. His charisma and visionary ideas made him a national hero. He appeared on television, explaining the future of space travel to families gathered around their black and white screens. Few knew, or chose to remember, where his journey had begun. In 1961, President J.F. Kennedy declared the goal of landing a man on the moon before the decade's end. It was von Braun's greatest challenge and his greatest redemption. As he oversaw the Apollo program, the man who had once worked for the Reich now stood at the forefront of America's dream. When Apollo 11 lifted off from Cape Kennedy in July 1969, its engines roared with the power born from both war and wonder. Millions watched in awe as Neil Armstrong took his first step on the moon, uttering words that would echo through history. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. For the public, it was a triumph of democracy, ingenuity, and courage. But behind the cheers and the waving flags, a more complicated truth lingered. America's victory in space had been built, in part, by men who had once served a monster. Shadows beneath the stars. As time passed, questions about Operation Paperclip began to surface. Journalists and historians unearthed declassified files revealing the extent to which the U.S. had concealed the Nazi backgrounds of its scientists. Moral debates raged. Had America traded justice for progress? Could a nation built on freedom truly celebrate achievements powered by the knowledge of those who had once enslaved others? Wernher von Braun himself faced scrutiny. Though he publicly distanced himself from Nazi ideology, survivors of the Mittelwerk camps remembered differently. Some recalled him seeing them among the prisoners, indifferent to their suffering. Yet history, complex, cruel, and captivating, rarely deals in absolutes. By the time of his death in 1977, von Braun had become both a symbol of scientific genius and a reminder of the uneasy compromises that built the modern world. The legacy of a hidden race. Today, few remember the name Operation Paperclip, but its impact surrounds us. In every satellite orbiting Earth, every rocket that breaks the sky, and every dream of reaching beyond the stars. The race that began in the ashes of war never truly ended. It simply changed its battleground. In the end, the story of Operation Paperclip is not just about rockets or scientists. It's about the choices nations make in pursuit of power, the blurred lines between right and wrong, victory and virtue. As one historian wrote, the Cold War wasn't won by soldiers, but by ghosts, men whose pasts we buried so we could build our future.
The scientists of the Third Reich. Hidden beneath the ruins of Hitler's Germany were brilliant and dangerous minds. Men who had built rockets for the Nazis, men whose inventions had rained fire over London, were suddenly the most wanted prize on earth. The war was ending, but a different kind of hunt had just begun. In 1945, as Allied soldiers marched through the rubble of a dying Reich, teams of intelligence officers moved quietly behind them, not searching for weapons or soldiers, but for men. Men whose minds could change the course of history. The Allies had heard rumors for years, whispers of secret laboratories, underground factories, and scientists who had turned physics into a weapon. Now, with Germany collapsing, those rumors became reality. Inside bombed-out castles, mountain tunnels, and hidden bunkers, the Allies discovered the remains of a scientific empire unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was the dark heart of Hitler's dream of technology, a world where science served destruction and genius bowed to tyranny. The Reich's obsession with science. Adolf Hitler had not only wanted to dominate the world politically, he wanted to engineer it. The Third Reich poured enormous resources into research, believing that superior technology could guarantee victory. The result was a strange paradox, a regime of barbaric ideology that simultaneously hosted some of the most advanced scientific programs in history. German scientists pioneered jet propulsion, synthetic fuels, guided missiles, and even the early theories of nuclear fission. But none of these programs captured Hitler's imagination like the rocket. He believed rockets could strike enemies across oceans and one day even reach the edge of space. To achieve this dream, the Reich turned to one man, Wernher von Braun, a young, ambitious engineer whose fascination with flight had begun in childhood. Peenemünde, birthplace of the vengeance weapons. On a remote island in the Baltic Sea, far from Allied bombers, von Braun built a city of science known as Peenemünde. Here, the Third Reich gathered its finest engineers, mathematicians, and physicists to develop a new class of weapon, one that could change the very nature of warfare. The result was the V-2 rocket, or Vergeltungswaffe 2, or Vengeance Weapon 2. It was the world's first long-range ballistic missile, a sleek, 46-foot rocket capable of flying 200 miles in less than 5 minutes and striking with deadly accuracy. When the V-2 was launched, it climbed to the edge of space before diving toward its target faster than the speed of sound. There was no warning, no sirens, just a sudden explosion, and then silence. By late 1944, thousands of V-2s had been fired at London, Antwerp, and Paris, killing civilians by the thousands. For the Allies, it was a weapon born from hell. For the scientists, it was proof that the future had already begun. The cost of genius. But Peenemunde's brilliance was built on human suffering. After Allied bombers struck the facility in 1943, production moved underground to Mittelwerk, a vast network of tunnels carved into the mountains of central Germany. There, tens of thousands of slave laborers, many from concentration camps, worked in brutal, deadly conditions to assemble the rockets. Prisoners were forced to work 12-hour shifts in darkness, starved, beaten, and hanged for the smallest mistakes. Over 20,000 people died constructing the V-2,
more than the number of civilians the rockets killed in London. Von Braun and his colleagues claimed later they had no power to stop the atrocities, but witnesses remembered seeing them walking through the tunnels, stepping over the dead to inspect the machinery. Their genius came wrapped in moral blindness. Still, to Allied intelligence, that genius was priceless. The Allies' most dangerous race. As Germany fell apart in 1945, both the United States and the Soviet Union realized that whoever captured these scientists would control the future of warfare and perhaps the future of space. The Soviets, advancing from the east, moved quickly to seize factories and laboratories. Meanwhile, in the west, U.S. Army intelligence units, known as the ALSOS mission and the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or JIOA, fanned out across Germany to locate key scientists before the Soviets could reach them. Von Braun and his team knew the end was near. Hunted by both sides, they fled Peenemünde with their blueprints and families, hiding in the Bavarian Alps. They decided to surrender, but only to the Americans. When U.S. troops finally found them in May 1945, they discovered not just a group of defeated Germans, but the architects of the future.
Operation Paperclip, America's secret bargain. Soon after, the U.S. launched Operation Paperclip, a covert plan to bring Nazi scientists to America under new identities. The American government knew the moral dilemma. Many of these men had been active Nazis, even war criminals. But the logic of the Cold War was unforgiving. The Soviets were already moving hundreds of scientists east, and the U.S. could not afford to fall behind. So the past was quietly erased. The U.S. Army cleaned the records, removing Nazi affiliations from personnel files. Wernher von Braun and over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were shipped to America, first to Texas, then to New Mexico and Alabama. To the public, they were technical experts, helping the United States with post-war research. In truth, they were the same men who had built the V-2 rockets that once terrorized Europe. From rockets of war to dreams of space. In the deserts of White Sands, New Mexico, the German scientists began rebuilding their old weapons, but now under the American flag. They launched test rockets using leftover V-2 parts, gathering invaluable data about the upper atmosphere, rocket stability, and propulsion. These early experiments laid the foundation for what would become the U.S. missile and space programs. Yet, for all their progress, the shadow of their past never disappeared. Some American officials protested, saying the U.S. had compromised its moral values by protecting former Nazis, but military leaders insisted that national security came first. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, the first artificial satellite, those arguments disappeared overnight. Fear and pride took over. The United States needed to catch up fast, and it was von Braun's team that had the experience to do it. The transformation of a nation's dream. By the 1960s, the man once branded as Hitler's rocket man had become America's chief architect of space exploration. Wernher von Braun now wore tailored suits, spoke perfect English, and appeared on television as the smiling face of NASA. Under his guidance, the Saturn V rocket was born, the most powerful machine ever built by humankind. It was von Braun's creation that carried astronauts to the moon, turning the tools of war into instruments of wonder. When Apollo 11 landed on the lunar surface in 1969, the world celebrated the triumph of American ingenuity. Few mentioned that the path to the moon had been paved by men who once built weapons for the Nazis. The moral question. The story of the scientists of the Third Reich is one of both brilliance and horror,
a reminder that progress often comes with a hidden cost. America's victory in the space race was in part a product of the very minds that once served tyranny. Their genius shaped the modern world, our satellites, our missiles, our exploration of space, but their moral legacy remains forever clouded. As historians later uncovered the truth about Operation Paperclip, questions resurfaced. Did America trade justice for power? Can the pursuit of knowledge ever justify the forgiveness of evil? For many, there is no simple answer, but what's undeniable is this: the scientists of the Third Reich changed history. Their rockets, once aimed at destruction, carried humanity beyond Earth's reach.
Operation Paperclip, America's secret mission. As the Cold War dawned, U.S. intelligence quietly launched a covert operation to bring hundreds of former Nazi scientists to America. Their crimes were buried under new identities, their pasts rewritten in the name of progress. The war was over, but the peace was fragile. Germany lay in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble, its leaders dead or imprisoned. The flags of victory flew proudly over Europe, yet in the shadows, another battle was already being fought, a battle not for land, but for minds. In the ashes of the Third Reich, the world's two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were racing to claim the spoils of Nazi science. Both knew that the war's most terrifying inventions had come not from generals, but from laboratories. And both knew that whoever captured those scientists first would own the future. What began as a hunt for justice soon became something else entirely, a secret mission that would rewrite the moral compass of a nation. The new war begins. By 1946, Europe had divided itself along a new fault line. The Soviet Union controlled the East, the United States and its allies held the West. Between them stretched an invisible wall of suspicion, a tension that would soon ignite the Cold War. Both sides needed an edge. The Soviets were rapidly rebuilding captured German factories, reverse engineering weapons, and absorbing thousands of engineers. Reports flooded Washington that Stalin's men had seized entire research teams from Peenemünde, the Nazi rocket center. For American intelligence, it was a nightmare scenario. The same minds that had built Hitler's V-2 rockets could now be helping the Soviets develop weapons capable of striking New York or Washington. Something had to be done, and fast. Thus, a covert plan was born inside the Pentagon's most secret corridors. Its name would later become infamous: Operation Paperclip. The birth of a secret. The mission's origins can be traced to the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or JIOA, a small but powerful unit of the U.S. military tasked with identifying and securing valuable German scientists before the Soviets could get to them. But there was a problem. Many of these scientists were not innocent researchers. They were active Nazis, some even accused of war crimes. Wernher von Braun, the rocket genius behind the V-2, was an SS officer. Others had used slave labor from concentration camps, conducted human experiments, or designed weapons of mass destruction. Under normal circumstances, these men would have faced trial at Nuremberg. Instead, their records were rewritten, their Nazi affiliations quietly removed, their crimes forgotten. In the name of science and survival, America was willing to look the other way. Operation Paperclip's motto was unspoken but clear: better to have them on our side than on the other.
smuggling the past into the future. Throughout 1946 and 1947, U.S. intelligence officers moved through occupied Germany with lists of targets, scientists, engineers, chemists, and physicians who had once served the Reich. Many were hiding in small towns or rural estates, terrified of being handed over to the Soviets. They were offered a deal. Come to America, work for us, and your past will be erased. One by one, they accepted. Some were flown out of Europe on secret military planes. Others were smuggled through American-occupied zones, carrying forged papers and fake names. Their new lives began in the United States, not as prisoners, but as honored guests. The same men who had once worked for Hitler now lived in suburban houses, sent their children to American schools, and drew paychecks from the U.S. government. They were told to forget the past. America already had. The rocket men of the New World. The most famous recruits were the rocket scientists from Peenemünde, led by Wernher von Braun. Initially stationed at Fort Bliss, Texas, and later at White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico, they began reconstructing the V-2 rocket from memory. The desert became their new laboratory. Under the blazing sun, American soldiers watched as these former enemies launched German-built rockets into the sky, the same kind that had once devastated London. The irony was staggering. The technology that had symbolized Nazi vengeance was now fueling America's dreams of supremacy.
The hidden faces of Operation Paperclip. But Operation Paperclip wasn't just about rockets. Hundreds of other German scientists found their way into American laboratories, universities, and corporations. Hubertus Strughold, a Luftwaffe physician once connected to human experiments, became known as the father of space medicine. Kurt Blome, who had tested chemical agents on prisoners, was hired to advise the U.S. Army on biological warfare. Arthur Rudolph, who supervised slave labor at the Mittelwerk tunnels, later managed the Saturn V program that sent Americans to the moon. Their pasts were classified, their names were sanitized, and the American public, hungry for progress, never asked too many questions. The Cold War justification. To U.S. officials, these compromises were necessary. The Soviets had launched their own version of Paperclip, known as Operation Osoaviakhim, transporting over 2,000 German scientists and their families to the Soviet Union. Stalin's engineers were already building long-range missiles based on V-2 designs. Intelligence reports warned that the Soviets might soon be capable of reaching American soil. For Washington, morality had to yield to strategy. As one officer famously said, "The enemy of my enemy is my asset." By 1949, Operation Paperclip had brought more than 1,600 German specialists to America. They were distributed across key industries: aerospace, chemistry, medicine, and electronics. Their work accelerated U.S. advancements by decades, from high-altitude flight research to the birth of NASA itself. The veil of secrecy. The operation remained classified for decades. Officially, the U.S. had only recruited non-political scientists who had been cleared of Nazi affiliations. In reality, documents had been altered, signatures forged, and crimes conveniently forgotten. When journalists and historians finally uncovered the truth in the 1980s, the revelations shocked the nation. Declassified memos showed that top officials, including those in the Pentagon and State Department, had knowingly concealed the backgrounds of men who had contributed to atrocities. Public outrage followed,
but the story was too complicated for easy judgment. Without Operation Paperclip, America might never have won the space race. Yet the moral cost was undeniable. A generation of war criminals had found sanctuary beneath the American flag.
From rockets to the moon. By the early 1960s, Operation Paperclip scientists had become American citizens. They appeared in magazines, on television, and in schools, inspiring a new generation of dreamers. Wernher von Braun, now working for NASA, became a national hero. His Saturn V rocket carried Apollo 11 to the moon in 1969, fulfilling President Kennedy's promise and defining a new era of exploration. As millions watched Neil Armstrong's first step on the lunar surface, few thought about the shadowed origins of that triumph. The engines that carried mankind to the stars had been born in the darkness of war. History, as it so often does, had blurred the line between redemption and complicity. The legacy of Operation Paperclip. Today, Operation Paperclip remains one of America's most controversial secrets. It stands as both a story of progress and a moral paradox, a reminder that the pursuit of power can twist even noble intentions. The program transformed former enemies into pioneers. It built the rockets that reached the moon and the missiles that defined the Cold War. It gave America an edge that shaped the modern world, but at the cost of justice, truth, and memory. As historians continue to unearth its hidden files, one question endureth: was it worth it? For some, the answer lies in the stars. For others, it lies in the graves of those who paid the price for science's darkest bargain.
From war machines to moon dreams. In the deserts of New Mexico and the labs of Alabama, these German engineers began transforming weapons of destruction into vessels of exploration. Under the stars, they dreamed of the same skies they once tried to conquer. The sound was familiar, a deep, thunderous roar that shook the desert floor. But this time, the target wasn't London. It was the heavens. In the silent plains of White Sands, New Mexico, the night sky burned with light as a V-2 rocket, the same weapon that once brought terror to Europe, tore through the atmosphere. Around it stood a group of German scientists, men who had once worn the insignia of Hitler's Third Reich, now dressed in U.S. Army uniforms. They watched in awe as the missile vanished into the black, leaving behind a plume of white fire. A cheer broke the desert silence. For the first time, humanity had touched space. This was not a battle. It was the birth of a dream. From Peenemünde to the Promised Land. A few years earlier, these same engineers had been prisoners of fate. When Nazi Germany fell in 1945, they faced capture, trial, or death. But instead of punishment, they were offered redemption, a secret invitation from the United States. Through Operation Paperclip, over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were brought to America, their Nazi records rewritten and their talents repurposed. Among them was the charismatic Wernher von Braun, the 33-year-old prodigy who had designed the V-2 rocket, the first human-made object to touch the edge of space. Von Braun's journey began not in a courtroom, but in the vast open deserts of America's Southwest. To the U.S. military, his knowledge was a weapon too valuable to waste. To von Braun himself, it was a second chance, not just to build rockets, but to build a future. The Desert Laboratory. In 1946, von Braun's team arrived at White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico. It was a landscape of extremes, endless dunes, scorching heat by day,
and freezing silence by night. But for these exiled scientists, it was paradise. Here, under total secrecy, they reconstructed the V-2 rockets using leftover parts shipped from Germany. Each test launch was a mix of science and redemption. What once had been an instrument of destruction was now a vessel of discovery. American soldiers who had once fought the Nazis now worked beside them, an uneasy alliance forged by necessity. Engineers measured data on temperature, fuel, and flight trajectory, while others monitored new experiments, radiation at high altitude, cosmic rays, and the thinness of the upper atmosphere. Each successful flight pushed humanity one step closer to understanding the world beyond Earth. The war machines were becoming dream machines. The dreamer in the desert. Wernher von Braun had always been a man caught between two worlds, science and conscience. In Peenemünde, he had built rockets for Hitler because it was the only way to realize his vision of space travel. Now, in America, that same vision had found a new home. Under the stars of New Mexico, von Braun often told his team, "We are not building weapons, we are building the future." Yet the line was still blurred. The Cold War was escalating, and the U.S. military wanted rockets that could carry nuclear warheads, not astronauts. Von Braun complied, but he never let go of his dream. He believed that one day rockets would carry men beyond the atmosphere, not to kill, but to explore. And in his imagination, he already saw it, a rocket so large it could carry humans to the moon. From Army projects to NASA's promise. By the early 1950s, von Braun's team was transferred to Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, a quiet southern town that would soon become the center of America's space ambitions. There, under the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, or ABMA, the German scientists developed the Redstone missile, the first U.S. ballistic missile capable of carrying a nuclear payload. It was a weapon born from the V-2's design, faster, more powerful, and more precise. But von Braun saw it differently. He saw a test bed for space travel. Every improvement in the Redstone's technology, its propulsion, guidance systems, and aerodynamics could be used for one ultimate goal: to break free from Earth. Then, in 1957, everything changed.
The shock of Sputnik. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite. It was a small, beeping metal sphere, but its signal echoed like a thunderclap across the globe. In living rooms across America, people listened to that eerie beep-beep coming from space, proof that the Soviets had beaten the United States to the heavens. The fear was immediate. If the Soviets could launch a satellite, they could launch nuclear missiles too. Panic spread through Washington. The president demanded answers. Congress poured billions into science and technology. And when the nation looked for someone who could send America to space, they turned to the man who had been preparing for this moment all along, Wernher von Braun. The birth of NASA. In 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, was established, absorbing von Braun's rocket team into its ranks. Huntsville, once a sleepy army town, now pulsed with ambition. Von Braun was no longer a war engineer. He was America's chief architect of the future. His team's first triumph came in 1961, when Alan Shepard became the first American to travel into space aboard a Mercury Redstone rocket, a direct descendant of the V-2. Months later, President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and declared a challenge that would define a generation. We choose to go to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. The dream that had once flickered in the desert now had the backing of a nation. Building the Saturn Dream. At NASA's Marshall Flight Center, von Braun and his team began working on the Saturn rockets, massive multi-stage launch vehicles that could carry astronauts beyond Earth's orbit. Each rocket test was a thunderous reminder of how far they had come, from underground factories of wartime Germany to gleaming laboratories of a democratic America. But the past never truly vanished. Journalists began uncovering von Braun's Nazi background, his SS membership, and his work at the Mittelwerk slave labor camps. He defended himself, saying his focus had always been science, not politics. Some believed him, others never forgave him. Yet, the American dream and the space race moved forward, from the shadows to the stars. On July 16, 1969, a massive white rocket, the Saturn V, stood tall at Cape Kennedy, Florida. Inside, 3 astronauts prepared for the most daring mission in human history, Apollo 11. As the countdown began, von Braun watched from the control room, his hands clasped, his expression unreadable. When the engines ignited, the roar was deafening. The ground trembled. The rocket rose, slowly at first, then faster until it disappeared into the sky, a column of fire reaching for eternity. 4 days later, humanity stood on the moon. When Neil Armstrong took his first step, the world celebrated America's triumph, the ultimate victory of freedom, science, and courage. Few remembered the story behind it, that the dream of the moon had been born in the ruins of war, carried across oceans by men whose hands had once built weapons of terror. The dual legacy. In the end, from war machines to moon dreams was more than a story of technology. It was a story of transformation. The German engineers who arrived as fugitives became American pioneers. The rockets that once symbolized fear became symbols of hope. And Wernher von Braun, once Hitler's prodigy, became the father of modern space exploration. Yet the moral shadow remains. Can redemption ever erase complicity? Can a dream built on dark foundations truly shine? History does not give easy answers, but it tells us this: progress is rarely pure, and the road to the stars is often paved with ghosts. As von Braun once said in reflection, "Our 2 greatest mistakes were to work for the Nazis and to think we could separate science from politics. In the end, the rocket always goes where it's aimed."
Wernher von Braun and the American Dream. At the heart of it all stood one man, Wernher von Braun, once Hitler's rocket prodigy, now America's space visionary. His genius propelled the United States into the space age, but his past would always follow him like a shadow. The camera flashes blinded him. The applause was thunderous. In July 1969, when Apollo 11's Saturn V rocket thundered toward the heavens, Wernher von Braun stood at Mission Control in Houston, his eyes fixed on the screen. He did not cheer. He simply whispered, "This is what I always dreamed of." But dreams, as von Braun knew too well, were never pure. For every cheer that night, there was also a whisper of the past, of the war, of rockets that once bore swastikas. This is the story of the man who helped America reach the moon, and how the price of his brilliance was paid in both glory and guilt. the boy who dreamed of the stars. Wernher Magnus Maximilian Wernher von Braun was born in 1912 to an aristocratic Prussian family. From an early age, he was fascinated by the stars. As a teenager, he read Hermann Oberth's book, The Rocket into Planetary Space, and decided that his destiny was not on Earth, but among the planets. He built small rockets in his backyard, often terrifying neighbors and alarming local police. But his obsession was unshakable. He believed mankind's future lay in space. By the time he entered university, Germany was collapsing under economic despair. Science became his refuge. Yet as his ambitions grew, so did the world's darkness. The Devil's Bargain. In 1932, Wernher von Braun's brilliance caught the eye of the German army. At just 20 years old, he was offered resources, unlimited funding, laboratories, and staff to develop rocket technology. There was one condition: his rockets had to serve the state. The state, in this case, was Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. When the Nazis came to power, von Braun found himself swept into their orbit. In 1937, he became technical director of the Peenemünde Army Research Center, where he led development of the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range ballistic missile. To von Braun, the V-2 was a scientific breakthrough, the first man-made object capable of reaching the edge of space. But to the world, it was a weapon of terror. Between 1944 and 1945, more than 3,000 V-2 rockets were launched at London and Antwerp, killing over 7,000 civilians. Even more horrifying, the rockets were built by slave laborers in the Mittelwerk underground factory, where tens of thousands died under inhumane conditions. Von Braun later claimed he was focused only on engineering, not politics. But history would never let him forget that his dream was paid in human suffering. The fall of the Reich and the race for the mind. As Nazi Germany crumbled in 1945, von Braun faced a choice: surrender to the Americans or fall into Soviet hands. He knew the Russians were close and that his knowledge could decide the balance of power in the post-war world. So he made his move. In May 1945, von Braun and his closest engineers surrendered to U.S. forces in Bavaria, carrying with them hundreds of blueprints, technical documents, and the secrets of rocket propulsion. The United States quickly recognized the value of what they'd captured. Through Operation Paperclip, von Braun and his team were quietly brought to America, their Nazi pasts buried under sanitized biographies. They were given new identities, new homes, and, most importantly, new missions. From the ruins to the Redstone.
In the dusty isolation of Fort Bliss, Texas, and later at White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico, von Braun began rebuilding the technology that had once terrorized Europe. The V-2 rockets, once aimed at cities, were now pointed toward the sky, instruments of exploration instead of destruction. To the U.S. Army, these rockets were the future of warfare. To von Braun, they were stepping stones to the stars. By the early 1950s, he and his team were transferred to Huntsville, Alabama, where they developed the Redstone missile, a direct descendant of the V-2. The Redstone became America's first successful medium-range ballistic missile, but von Braun saw it as something more, a launch vehicle that could one day carry humans into space. A vision for the stars. While still under the Army's control, von Braun became a public advocate for space exploration. In 1952, he published The Mars Project, a detailed plan for a manned mission to the Red Planet. Later, in collaboration with Walt Disney, he appeared on television specials explaining how rockets could take humanity to the moon. Millions of Americans watched, fascinated. the man who had once built weapons for Hitler, was now teaching children to dream about space. But that dream was about to face its greatest test, the Sputnik shock. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. The world changed overnight. America, the land of progress and power, suddenly found itself behind. The fear was palpable. If the Soviets could launch a satellite, they could launch nuclear missiles. The space race had begun, and Washington was desperate for answers. In that moment of national panic, Wernher von Braun emerged as America's secret weapon. Despite years of bureaucratic hesitation, his Redstone rocket was ready. On January 31, 1958, it carried Explorer 1, the first U.S. satellite into orbit. America was back in the race, and von Braun became a national hero. The birth of NASA and the American dream. Later that year, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, was founded, absorbing von Braun's rocket team into its structure. Huntsville, once a quiet southern town, became the cradle of the American space age. Von Braun's charm and vision won over politicians and the public alike. He spoke of space travel not as fantasy, but as destiny. His message resonated deeply in a post-war America searching for hope, unity, and purpose. When President J.F. Kennedy announced in 1961 that the United States would land a man on the moon before the decade's end, it was von Braun's technology and his dream that made it possible. Building the road to the moon. Under von Braun's leadership at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, his team developed the Saturn I, Saturn IB, and ultimately the Saturn V, the most powerful rocket ever built. Every launch was a symphony of science and ambition. Thousands of engineers, scientists, and technicians worked under von Braun's direction. His perfectionism was legendary, his charisma magnetic. To those who worked with him, he was both an inspiration and a demanding commander. On July 16, 1969, when Apollo 11 launched from Cape Kennedy, von Braun's life's work reached its zenith. As the Saturn V soared into the blue, he stood silently, his face illuminated by the rocket's flame. 4 days later, when Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, von Braun's childhood dream had become reality. A vision once born in the laboratories of Nazi Germany, now fulfilled in the name of freedom. The shadow that never faded. But not everyone celebrated unconditionally. In the years that followed, journalists and historians began digging deeper into von Braun's wartime past. His connection to the SS, his awareness of the slave labor used at Middlework, his silence during the atrocities, all resurfaced. He defended himself, insisting he had been apolitical, that his sole loyalty was to science. But the moral weight of his past never disappeared. To many, he remained a man divided, both a visionary and a moral enigma. As he once admitted in a rare interview, "You can't separate science from the world it serves. I wanted to reach the stars, but I was forced to build weapons first." The final years. In the 1970s, von Braun's influence waned. The Apollo missions ended, NASA's budget was slashed, and public fascination shifted. He retired from NASA in 1972 and joined Fairchild Industries, advocating for space stations and Mars missions until his health declined. He died in 1977, at the age of 65, still dreaming of mankind's future among the stars. Today, his legacy remains one of the most complex in history. Without him,
America might never have reached the moon. Yet his genius was born from a system of oppression and war. The dual legacy of a dreamer. Wernher von Braun and the American Dream is not just a story about rockets. It's about redemption, ambition, and the moral cost of progress. Von Braun embodied the contradictions of the 20th century. A man who fled tyranny to serve freedom, who transformed instruments of destruction into symbols of human possibility, yet never fully escaped the ghosts of his past. He gave America the stars, but left it with questions that still echo. Can genius ever be innocent? Can a dream built on darkness truly shine? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere between earth and moon, in that vast silence where all human ambitions, noble and flawed, finally meet the stars.
The price of progress. When Apollo 11 touched down on the moon, the world celebrated humanity's triumph. But behind every cheer lay a haunting question. How far should a nation go in the name of science? And whose hands truly built America's space dream? The world held its breath. July 20th, 1969. A grainy television signal flickered into millions of living rooms. A human figure, wrapped in white, descended a ladder and spoke words that would echo through eternity. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Cheers erupted across the globe. America had done the impossible. The moon, humanity's ancient companion, now bore the footprints of Earth. But as the world celebrated, few paused to ask how that moment had been made possible. Beneath the glory of Apollo 11 lay a story shrouded in moral compromise, a story of ambition, secrecy, and the uneasy marriage between science and power. This is the untold side of America's greatest triumph, the true price of progress. Shadows beneath the stars. Behind the blinding light of the rocket flames were men whose pasts burned darker than most dared to imagine. Many of the minds that built America's rockets were not born in freedom. They had served a dictator. When Nazi Germany collapsed in 1945, the U.S. and the Soviet Union raced not only to claim territory, but to claim brains. Through Operation Paperclip, more than 1,600 German scientists and engineers, many of them former Nazis, were secretly brought to the United States. Their crimes and affiliations were buried under new identities. Their talents were too valuable, their knowledge too advanced for moral hesitation. In the Cold War shadow, ethics became a casualty of urgency. Among them was Wernher von Braun, Hitler's former rocket prodigy, who would later lead NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and designed the Saturn V, the mighty rocket that carried Apollo 11 to the moon. To the public, von Braun was the face of American ingenuity, a visionary with a charming German accent and a dream of reaching the stars. To historians, he was a man haunted by ghosts. Ghosts from the Mittelwerk tunnels, where thousands of slave laborers died building his V-2 rockets during the war. And the forgotten builders. In the euphoric retelling of space history, little is said about the men who actually built the first rockets, not in laboratories, but in underground hells. During World War II, the V-2 rocket program relied on forced labor from the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp. Prisoners were starved, beaten, and worked to death in the damp tunnels beneath the Harz Mountains. Historians estimate over 20,000 people died there, more than were killed by the rockets themselves. When the war ended,
The survivors were liberated, but their captors were given new lives. The engineers went to America, the laborers went into graves. And so, when the first V-2 was launched from American soil in 1946, it was not just a technical experiment, it was a moral one. Could the pursuit of progress justify erasing the past? Operation Paperclip, a necessary evil? In the desperate climate of the early Cold War, U.S. officials made their choice. The Soviet Union had seized dozens of German scientists for its own rocket program. America could not fall behind. The moral calculus was simple, if chilling. Better that these men served democracy than tyranny. Documents were falsified. Nazi Party records were destroyed. Scientists who had built weapons for Hitler were now given citizenship, government jobs, and homes in the American South. General Leslie Groves, the same man who oversaw the Manhattan Project, summarized it coldly. If we didn't get them, the Russians would. That was all that mattered. It was not the first time in history that morality bent before survival, and it wouldn't be the last. From rockets to dreams. In Huntsville, Alabama, von Braun and his team began working for the U.S. Army, developing the Redstone and Jupiter missiles. Their purpose was clear: deliver nuclear warheads across continents. But von Braun's ambitions were higher, literally. He spoke passionately about space exploration, publishing books and appearing on Walt Disney's television specials, where he explained the possibility of space stations and moon missions. He became America's unlikely celebrity scientist, a bridge between the military's ambitions and the public's imagination. His German accent, once a symbol of the enemy, now carried the cadence of optimism. By 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, was born, and von Braun's rocket team was absorbed into the new agency. What had begun as a military weapons project was transformed into the world's most ambitious scientific enterprise.
Triumph and tension. The 1960s were an age of contradictions. America was divided by race, by war, by ideology, yet united by one collective dream: to reach the moon before the Soviets. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy declared, "We choose to go to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is hard." It was both a challenge and a gamble. The nation poured billions into NASA's Apollo program. Factories across the country roared with production. Thousands of engineers worked day and night. At the center of it all stood von Braun, directing the creation of the Saturn V, the most powerful rocket ever built. The irony was not lost on him. The man who once built weapons for a dictator was now fulfilling a dream for democracy. The moon and the mirror. When Apollo 11 landed, the victory seemed absolute. The Cold War's technological race had reached its climax. America had claimed the stars. But as von Braun basked in the triumph, his past crept back into public consciousness. Journalists began revisiting his role in the Nazi regime, his membership in the SS, and his silence about the suffering in Mittelwerk. Some accused him of moral cowardice, a man who looked away from horror in pursuit of science. Others defended him as a visionary trapped by history. Von Braun himself once said, "I was a scientist who dreamed of space travel. My crime was that my dream came too soon and in the wrong place." Science without conscience. The debate surrounding Operation Paperclip and von Braun's legacy raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of progress itself. Can innovation exist without morality? Is knowledge neutral, or does it inherit the sins of its creators? These questions extended beyond rockets.
In laboratories across the world, the Cold War had turned science into a battlefield. Nuclear weapons, biological research, surveillance technology, all born in the name of advancement. The story of von Braun became a parable for an entire era, the moment when humanity's reach exceeded its reflection. The moral reckoning. In the years after Apollo, NASA faced new scrutiny. Civil rights leaders questioned how a nation could spend billions on space while poverty raged at home. Historians dug deeper into the paperclip files, uncovering the true extent of the government's moral compromises. For many Americans, the realization was painful. The same system that had lifted mankind to the moon had also buried uncomfortable truths beneath the stars. But perhaps that is the paradox of progress, that every great leap forward leaves shadows behind. The legacy of the price. By the time von Braun died in 1977, he was both celebrated and condemned. Streets, schools, and science centers bore his name, yet his biography remained forever entangled with the darkest chapter of human history. Today, the rockets that carry satellites and astronauts into space still trace their lineage to the designs born in wartime Germany. The technology of exploration and destruction remains separated only by intention. In the words of one NASA historian, "We went to the moon on the backs of men who once built weapons for a dictator. History's greatest dream was built from its greatest nightmare." Epilogue: The Human Equation. The story of the price of progress is not just about Wernher Braun or Operation Paperclip. It is about us, the species that dares, that builds, that reaches beyond the sky, even when our hands are not clean. The moon landing proved what humanity can achieve when it dreams big enough. But it also reminded us that technology alone cannot define civilization. Because in the end, the real measure of progress is not how far we can go, but what we are willing to sacrifice to get there.